Hello and welcome to Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm your host, Dane Waters. I'm coming to you live today from Istanbul, Turkey. So a lot to talk about. So let's do a little quick recap, and then we're very honored to have an amazing guest with us today, which will leave you in anticipation here for a couple of seconds. So what's going on around the world? Well, there in Africa, the Ghanaian elections took place. The opposition won. It's been one of those rotating cycles where every, 2 terms, the opposition party comes in. But I have to say that the incumbent party, I think it's going to go, people will see this as one of those elections you look at and say, why did they do that? I mean, trying to run an election that talks about break the 8 years, that's not about the people. That's more about them. But that's for another day to talk about. U.S., we always have to talk about the U.S. and what's going on there because there's never a dull moment there. I think that what you're seeing is that Donald Trump is, in his first news interview, talked a lot about immigration and what's going to happen. Immigration in the U.S. is going to be a big, huge issue, like it is in countries all over the world. He's talking about mass deportations on day one. He's talking about taking away birthrights. It's going to be interesting, but I think that you'll see some very radical changes in the United States, good or bad, up to the individual beholder. We'll have to see how that goes. For ants, one of the great things, Notre Dame just opened up after the horrible fire. I can't wait to get over there to see it. But, France is going through their trials and tribulations with, they're looking for a new prime minister. I think I'll apply for that job. Romanian elections were overturned. I mean, come on. I mean, what do you expect when the Russians get in there and use TikTok to kind of, convince people to vote for a nobody? What do you expect to happen? And then, of course, this leads us into our next conversation, which is about the Middle East, Hamas, Hezbollah, what's going on in Lebanon, Israel, will the ceasefire hold? But the last thing I'll say before we go to a quick break is that the F1 season, for those of you who like Formula One racing, which is one of my passions, Abu Dhabi was over the weekend. McLaren won the Constructors' Championship, but one thing they're talking about is that they need to expand into Africa. They don't have any races in Africa. They used to have one in South Africa, but who knows if that's going to come back. But I think all of us need to petition the F1 world to say, listen, Africa, especially maybe somewhere like Lagos, may be the place for the next F1 race for the 2027 season. Anyway, we have a lot to talk about. When I come back, we're going to meet our amazing guest, Ambassador Frank Baker. So let's take a quick break and see you in a few minutes. Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm your host, Dane Waters. Before the break, I said I'll see you in a couple of minutes. It's amazing how, a couple of minutes boils down to a few seconds. So I must always remain vigilant. Listen, we're very honored today to have with us Ambassador Frank Baker. I've known ambassadors all over the world, and I have to tell you, he is the best and the brightest that there is. He was the UK ambassador to Kuwait, Iraq, and Libya. Don't know the exact sequencing there, so forgive me on that. But truly, he is the guy and the kind of ambassador that the world needs, especially during these diplomatic and difficult times. But anyway, thanks, Frank, for joining us today. It's good to see you.
Thanks, Dane. Good to be here.
Well, today we're going to talk about Syria. I mean, that's what everyone's talking about. It's one of those things that not even I expected or anybody expected. To me, Assad's been in power for 50 years, but I guess there is proof that authoritarians can be beat. So let's just start with the basics. What does this mean for the world and the region, and who are the winners and the losers?
Yeah, well, I think you're right that very few people saw this coming, at least not as quickly as it did. On the other hand, of course, they do say that dictatorships tend to fall very slowly at first and then very quickly at the end. And that was classic, what we saw over the weekend in Syria. I mean, I think it's probably worth looking just a little bit of the history around this, Dane, before we talk about the concept and the likelihood of what's going to happen in the region now. It's worth remembering, first of all, that the Baathists, essentially the Syrian Ba'ath Party as opposed to the Iraq Ba'ath Party, although the two were actually combined in the early days. But the Baathists, in the form of the Assad family, have ruled Syria for 50 years. So this really was a significant weekend in Middle East history. The Baathists, the Assad family, I think over the last 50 years had moved very much from initially brutal. Went through a little period once the Hafez Assad, the father, once he died and Bashar took over. And it's worth saying here, actually, it's quite an interesting story that Bashar Assad was never meant to be the leader of Syria. It was his elder brother Basil who was groomed by the father to become Syrian leader. But Basil Assad, like many of his type, funnily enough, was a freak for fast cars. Given your comments about Formula One, and one foggy morning in Damascus in, I think it was 1994. Forgive me if I got the year wrong. He was driving up to the airport in his Mercedes far too fast, crashed and killed himself. And so Bashar Assad was dragged back from London, where he was an ophthalmologist. He was an eye surgeon, to be groomed to take over from the father, which he subsequently did a few years later. And then, of course, he went through a period of, because he was different to Hafez, because he had quite a glamorous British wife, Syrian British wife. He was seen as potentially a good guy within the region, right up until 2011 and the Arab Spring, and then the classic Assad came out with the demonstrations against him initially, and then brutally suppressed, and the rest is history, as they say. So you've had 50 years of the Assads. You've had 50 years of them playing both sides, but certainly in the last decade, playing very much with the Iranians, being very close to the Iranians, and of course close to the Russians, because it was the Russians that essentially kept Bashar Assad in power in 2015, well, after the Syrian civil war, which came out of the Arab Spring in the early part of the last decade, and the Russian military, essentially the Russian Air Force, kept Assad in power by bombing the opposition groups, killing many people. Assad, of course, brutally repressed his people as well, and so you had a situation up until about two weeks ago, I suppose, where you had an uneasy stalemate that had lasted for about 4 or 5 years, where you had a number of opposition groups around Syria who had survived the onslaught from the Russian, Iranian, Syrian armed forces, but who nobody really thought were in a position to be able to make big move on against Assad. Certainly Assad didn't think that, because over the last 2 years he's been noticeable that he has refused to negotiate with anybody, despite pressure from other states within the Arab world. So what happened? Well, I think, when you're looking at today's Middle East, I think there are two things that you should look at that have happened in the very recent past. The first one is you need to go back to the first Trump term, when one of the big foreign policy successes of that first Trump term were the Abraham Accords, where the American the Trump administration worked very hard within the Middle East, with Israel and with the individual Arab countries, to reach bilateral peace agreements, including bilateral diplomatic relations, etc., between Israel and those countries. So you had a situation back in 2020 where Israel opened up embassies in the United Arab Emirates, in Bahrain, in Sudan, in Morocco, in these countries that they never had before. This had never happened before. This was a big move. But the big prize was always going to be Saudi Arabia. And there was move towards that by the first Trump administration, which was then stopped when Biden won the 2020 election and moved forward. And that those largely, I think, probably, two reasons. I think one, because I think the Biden administration were less interested in the Abraham Accords, in moving it forward, but also because, of course, the Biden administration, certainly in the early days, had a pretty bad relationship with Saudi Arabia because of comments that Biden had made about MBS previously. So over the last 4 years, the Abraham Accords have essentially been frozen. The countries that had opened up the diplomatic relations with Israel have maintained those diplomatic relations. There's never been any suggestion, even over the last 18 months, that they would move away from that. Israeli ambassadors have remained either in post or going in and out of the country, depending upon depending upon which country it is. And so you have had a situation where, but the big prize has remained the Israel-Saudi rapprochement. And there are many people out there who will claim that one of the major factors behind the appalling events of October the 7th last year was an attempt to stop that possible rapprochement between the Saudis and the Israelis, to make it impossible for Saudis to do a deal with Israel because of what was predicted to be the Israeli response to those atrocious events. Over the last 14 months, what you have seen though is almost it's almost gone the other way. I mean, people completely misread this. You have seen a hollowing out of the opposition forces to Israel within the region. Now, to understand that, we need to go back to Iran, because at the same time as you had the Abraham Accords over the last, probably 6, 7 years ago now, but you over the last 10, 15 years, you've seen the Iranians gradually build, in fact, from the 1980s, if you're looking at Hezbollah, but more recently, seeing the Iranians build up what they saw as this, you can argue either way, was it a defensive or offensive protection against the people that they saw as their enemies in the Middle East. And so they of course worked closely with Hezbollah. They've worked very closely with Syria, and Syria is critical to this, and we'll come on to that later, because Syria was the land route that they could get in to support Hezbollah. That's now gone. You have then they of course allied themselves with the Houthis back at the end of probably 10, 12 years ago, during the Yemeni civil war. The Houthis had not been historically that close to the Iranians, even though they were a Shia group. But over the last 10, 12 years, they've become much closer for reasons that we could talk about on another day. And then, of course, they also began working closely with Hamas since Hamas took over Gaza after the decision to essentially move to turn Gaza into a Palestinian area back in 2005, 2006 by Sharon. So I think that, which was the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. So I think that what you've seen is the Iranians have built up what they thought was a very strong position within the Middle East. They also, of course, have influence over Iraq. They have influence with the Iraqi Shia militias, although personally, having been in Iraq for 3 years during the fight against Daesh back in the last decade, I think that influence is often overstated. So but over the last 14 months, what have you seen? You've seen Hamas effectively destroyed on the ground, not completely, but militarily destroyed by the Israelis. You've seen Hezbollah similarly destroyed in southern Lebanon militarily by the Israelis. You've seen the leadership of these organizations having been removed in strikes by the Israelis. And now you see the fall of Assad and the fall of Iran's close ally in Syria. And this morning, I saw that Abu Mohammed al-Jalani, who is the head of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, who we'll call them HTS to make it easier, the group that is essentially in Damascus now. Jalani himself is an interesting character. We can come on to him later. But they have said this. He has said very clearly this morning that the only enemies are Iran and Russia. And he was talking in terms of, we want to live peacefully with our Israeli friends. So now, words are easy, aren't they? It's actions that are important. But you have a situation this morning where the Iranians are very isolated. There are, by all accounts, a lot of discussions, shall we say, going on in the corridors of power of Tehran. So you have a Middle East that potentially could look very, very different in the years to come.
Well, it's fascinating, because let me ask you this about HTS. I mean, but as you know, there's a lot of different groups participated in the opposition and overthrowing Assad. One concern that's been raised is that does the head of the HTS have the ability to actually govern the country? Can he consolidate all these different factions, or will Syria end up being divided? Because stability in Syria, I would think, would be very critical to redefining the Middle East.
Yeah, and that's one of the big questions that is on everybody's lips this morning. I mean, it's probably worth having a look at those groups that are in Syria, the opposition groups who have worked hard. They haven't actually worked together, but they've fought separately against the Assad regime and their supporters. I mean, you have, as I say, HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Shami, That is that's the one that has really grabbed the headlines because it's their fighters that moved down through Aleppo towards Damascus over the weekend. But you've also got the Syrian Democratic Forces, which of course are the Kurdish group. They're up essentially in the northeast of Syria. They have been supported by the West. They've also been supported, of course, by they're also close because they're Kurds to the other Kurds within the region. Consequently, Turkey, who we haven't mentioned yet, but who are a critical player in Syria, are opposed to the SDF because they believe them to be an offshoot of the PKK, the terrorist organization in Turkey. You've got then the Syrian National Army, who is a loosely affiliated group of militias who are supported by Turkey, have been supported by Turkey over the last decade. They have been up on the northwestern border, the Turkish border, where they've been working closely with the Turks, supported by the Turks. And then you've got the Free Syrian Army down in the south, which has been supported by the West and also ostensibly, so people say, by Israel. So you've got these factions. Of course, there are other factions as well, and many people in Syria don't belong to any of these factions. You've got the Alawites, which were the Assad clan up on the coast, the north coast of Syria. You've got a lot of people in Syria who, as I say, are not affiliated to any of these groups, but all of whom I think share one thing in common, which is that they yearn for a period of an extended period of peace. So the question is, can these groups work together? B is we can come on to Jelani, who is an interesting character. Of course, Jelani was a university in Damascus when he left halfway through his university course. Essentially became radicalized, went to Iraq, was radicalized in Anbar, worked with some of the Sunni groups that opposed the 2003 events, I shall say, diplomatically in Iraq. And then became he formed his own organization, which became an Al-Qaeda offshoot. It was then part of the work towards the supposed caliphate in Syria back in 2014 that was announced in Syria. Then moved it back into Iraq, of course, but then turned his back on it all and said, that's it, moving away from all of this, and began to work with his people in Syria against Assad, but also now claims to have moved completely away from the jihadi movement, and is looking to move Syria forward in, if you look at his comments this morning, in a completely different direction. Now, what is the truth? It's far too early to say. We can't speculate. I think, as I said at the beginning, it's going to be deeds, not words, that we have to watch.
Yeah, it's very fascinating because we definitely want to come back to that point about deeds versus actions, deeds versus words. So listen, we have to take a quick break, then we'll get back here and continue this conversation. Thanks a lot. Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. Guess what? I'm your host, still your host, Dane Waters, until they fire me. But let's get going back to this. So listen, we talk about what's going on in Syria, that there's just so much uncertainty. I mean, one thing about Syria, Lebanon, that whole region is, as you know, more than best than anybody, is that it's very complex. It's just not some simple black and white issues in these countries. So let's talk about the international players. I mean, who can make a difference? Who should make a difference? We saw President-elect Trump come out yesterday, I believe it was, saying that, that we need to stay away from Syria. It's not our fight. We shouldn't get involved. Do you think that's the right approach for America? And if not, I mean, what should America do or other countries do in Syria now?
Well, I think first of all, before we talk about the US, Dane, let's just touch on Russia because the other big loser apart from Assad and Iran in this has been Russia. The Russians have since the times of Catherine the Great been looking for warm water ports for their fleet. Don't have them up in Russia. of course, now don't have them in the Black Sea, and that's not really warm water, but have had over the last few decades this naval base in Tartus in Syria. It looks like they've now lost that. Then they're really pushing to try and maintain a hold on it, but all the signs are that they've lost that because of their support for Assad. They also had an air base in Kamimim, which they will also have lost. Now that's significant because that really gives them a big problem in the Mediterranean. Because how do they? One of the things that I'm just going to touch on very, very briefly because I know we're relatively short time, has been the work of the Wagner Group in Africa over the last 20 years. This one an African show over the last 20 years, 15, 20 years. The Wagner Group have always been supported out of the Syrian air bases and naval bases. The problem for the Russians is now, where do they go? People talk about them going to work with Haftar in Benghazi or somewhere along that North African coast. But the problem for the Russians is that they can't fly fully loaded air cargo planes that distance. That's why they had to use Kamimim Air Base before, or Tartus Naval Base, because they just don't have the range for their aircraft to be able to use Benghazi or Tobruk as somewhere that they can reinforce those groups, that Wagner group, because their aircraft don't have the range. So that's a really interesting issue that we could talk about another day. But they are a very, very big loser. Right, what should we do about it? Look, I mean, I'm not going to second guess President Trump. President Trump has been elected twice now, very clearly stating no more wars, no foreign wars. He was true to that in his first term. But I think it is also worth remembering that when he needed to act, as he did against the Syrian chemical weapons attacks, he did. And when he needed to, he decided to act against the Iranians, he did, because he assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. So I think it's worth remembering that doesn't preclude necessarily drone strikes and missile strikes. But he's always been very clear that he does not want to be involved in starting up new wars around the globe, which I think actually is something that we can all support. What do we do in Syria? Well, as I say, it's very, very early days. I think the first thing we need is to actually have a better understanding of what Giuliani and the other groups really want to do in Syria. How do they really want to play this? They've made an interesting start. You could say a good start, because they've been releasing prisoners. They've been destroying the areas where the torture centres. They're certainly saying the right things about working closely with the West and coming up with some kind of peace agreement with Israel, which incidentally I should say that Assad was offered on many occasions and turned down. But as I said, we are going to have to wait. I think it's too early really to say what is going to happen, and it's in many ways it's too early to say exactly what we should be doing, other than talking to. We should begin dialogue with these organisations now. We should be talking to them now. As of Sunday, we should have been talking to them to ensure that what they are saying they really believe in, and B, they're going to do. And if they want our help to do that, then I think from a Western perspective that is exactly what we should be doing. We should be helping them. But that doesn't mean getting involved militarily. I think that was President Trump's point, that it doesn't mean that you land that the Eighth Army land on the shores of Syria tomorrow. No, that's not what they need. What they need is a diplomatic approach through diplomatic channels, talk to them, see how they really do want to play this, and advise. If they want advice, help, we can advise them, we can help them. Goodness knows, we've made a lot of mistakes over the last 50 years, longer than that, throughout history in the Middle East. But we've also learned a lot of lessons about bringing peace and security to countries. One of the good examples of that is Iraq, isn't it? Look at Iraq. That was a mess, but today they have elections, so they have an elected government. They have peaceful transfers of power, and they now have the third largest gold reserves in the Middle East.
Well, listen, I think that's a critical part. I agree with you about Donald Trump. I mean, listen, I'm not a warmonger. I don't think that we just need to go in there and just continue wars around the world. So I support the reality that we need to find a way to limit wars around the world. But we do need to have a dialogue, in my opinion. We can't have a leadership vacuum there where America is not sitting at the table, because definitely the Turks are going to be actively involved. The Israelis are going to be actively involved. Who knows who else is going to be actively involved? But what's interesting, though, is that you see, the U.S. made strikes into Syria to deal with ISIS. You had the Israelis had strikes into Syria to deal with the chemical weapons, and you had the Turks, of course, doing what they were doing to try to deal with the remnants of the PKK, or what they believe are the PKK, in certain parts of Syria. So you have a lot of foreign actors already involved in Syria, even while this coup, for lack of a better term, this transfer of power is taking place, which means that it is an area where there's a lot of international interest. Well, I'm going to switch real quick to talk about Hezbollah, because one thing that this is doing, in my opinion, is the fact that Iran was using, as you said earlier, Syria as a supply route for Hezbollah, but now that's shut down completely. So Hezbollah definitely is on the down and out, and I think that I was going to ask your opinion. What do you think this means for the Lebanese people? I mean, is there an opportunity to finally rid the country of Hezbollah?
Oh, I think so, very definitely, absolutely. I've actually felt that for several months now. But this really does make it easier for Lebanese people. I think it's a fantastic opportunity for Lebanon to rid themselves of a militia in their midst. How the Lebanese people again do that is entirely up to them. But there's plenty of support coming in from the West, of course, particularly from France and the US into Lebanon. So there's a real opportunity now for Lebanon, I think, to move forward and rediscover. Dane, you and I are old enough to remember what Lebanon was like pre 1982, 1981. Real opportunity for them to grasp that I should say a chance for them to grasp that opportunity and to move forward. And I think we would all want to see that, because I absolutely agree with you. It's about, and I think that's where President Trump comes from. It's about stopping war, and nobody can disagree with that. Stopping war. It's also about, of course, protecting yourself from the bad actors, but it's about stopping war. And the best way to stop war in Syria is going to be through dialogue. You're absolutely right on that, and that's what I alluded to earlier. We need to go in and we need to start talking, and we need to be making sure that the various disparate groups do talk to each other. I think that the military action we saw over the weekend, incidentally, will probably be welcomed, frankly, by the new groups, the new political parties, shall we call them, the new potential leadership candidates in Syria. Getting rid of Al Qaeda is a great thing. Dealing with the chemical weapons is obviously absolutely inimical to moving forward. So I think that that is not something I think that is going to be opposed by any of these people.
Listen, I think that we're running out of time here. So listen, I think that there are definitely winners and losers. You talk about Russia, loser; Iran, loser. Winners, I think, those who believe in a more democratic and free. Let's not say democratic, more free Middle East. I think that the world is changing in a very positive way. I think it shows that authoritarians can be beat. I think that I know my friends in Ukraine are very excited about what they're seeing, because they believe that it has diminished Russia's power, and that they gives them more impetus to fight harder against Russia. Anyway, so in closing, you got 30 seconds. Tell us what the world should know in 30 seconds, Frank.
Well, what I would say is I think that the world should continue to watch carefully. I mean, I think the Middle East has for many years been a real flashpoint for trouble. I think that everything that's happened over the last 40 months, and I go back to that point, started by those appalling events on October the 7th. But since then, despite all of the issues that have arisen around that, I do think that the Middle East is moving towards being a potentially safer place, and I think that we should all welcome that and hope that that is the case.
Listen, thanks a lot for that. And as I said at the beginning of the show, I really wish the world had more ambassadors like you around the world. I think the world would still be a much better place if they had that. So listen, thanks, Frank, for joining us today and being on Around the World with Dane Waters. I look forward to continue this conversation in the near future. Anyway, thanks, world, for watching today.
Thanks, Dane.
And we'll talk next week. Talk to you later.